حمدا كثيرا طيبا مباركا فيه والصلاة والسلام الأتمان الأكملان على خير خلق الله أجمعين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه وبعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. This is the last session of the conference, the English-speaking conference, and one more last remaining topic, inshallah, related to the sciences of Hadith. But before we get into this session's topic, I just wanted to make two clarifications from the last session that I had. The first clarification was regarding the tabi'i who I mentioned, who lived in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and he didn't have the privilege of meeting the Prophet ﷺ. So we mentioned it was Abdurrahman al-Mahdi, but that was a mistake. Abdurrahman al-Mahdi was from the Atba' tabi'in, and he was born after the Prophet ﷺ. What I meant was Abu Uthman al-Nahdi. Abu Uthman al-Nahdi. So this tabi'i, he lived in the time of the Prophet ﷺ. He lived in Jahiliyyah, right? Meaning before prophethood even. He made Hajj twice before the prophethood, right? And he lived a very long life. He lived until the age of 130. He lived until the age of 130. But he never met the Prophet ﷺ. He accepted Islam while the Prophet ﷺ was alive. He only made hijrah or moved to Medina in the khilafah of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anh. And he participated in the battles, in the battles like the famous battles of Yarmouk and the other battles in the time of Umar radiyallahu anhu. That was the first clarification. Number two, the second clarification, it's not really a clarification, but to add on what we said regarding the Sahabah who narrated ahadith. So we mentioned certain companions who narrated many ahadith, right? We mentioned the top narrators of hadith among the Sahabah, and some may be wondering, how about those who were very close to the Prophet ﷺ, who without a doubt must have heard more ahadith? Like we mentioned Abu Hurairah, who came in the 7th year of the Hijrah, accepted Islam and joined the Prophet ﷺ and only remained with him 3 years. There's no doubt that someone like Umar radiyallahu anhu or Abu Bakr heard much more than Abu Hurairah in his lifetime from the Prophet ﷺ. So why isn't Abu Bakr or Umar radiyallahu anhu among the top narrators of hadith? So the scholars mention various reasons for this, but the primary reason is that these companions were busy. They were busy with the khilafah. So Abu Bakr, after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, was busy. When you're busy with something, it's difficult to, devote your time to knowledge and teaching. But then one can say Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, his khilafah only lasted 2 years. So maybe that's another reason. How about Umar radiallahu anh, whose khilafah was very long, right? Whose khilafah was very long. So we say the same thing, that he was busy with the khilafah, and so that prevented him from narrating as much as the others that we mentioned. All right. The topic that we have in this session is the science behind the preservation of the Sunnah. The science behind the preservation of the Sunnah. And so we learned about the preservation of the Sunnah and how the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ has been preserved. We learned how the Hadith were compiled, how they were transmitted from one generation to the next. And this system is a system that we Muslims should be proud of, right? When you look at other civilizations and other religions, you find that they are satisfied with not really having a credible system and way of verifying what is attributed to their leaders and their founders. Right? Just take the example of Christianity. Just take the example of Christianity. We have their Bible, and they acknowledge, Christian academics and scholars acknowledge that some of the authors of the Bible, we don't even know who they were. They are unknown people. Even, the Gospels that they have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the 4 main Gospels that they have, the identities of the authors, it's not certain. Right? And this is something that they admit. Right? They say that these individuals, Matthew, Mark, Luke, etc., are actually pseudonames of individuals who, their identity remains unknown to us. But then when it comes to Islam, we have a very, very, meticulous, rigid system that our scholars, and we're talking about the very early scholars of Islam, put together to make sure that what is attributed to our Prophet ﷺ, it is certain, it is verified, it can be tested for its authenticity. And this system is known as the Isnad system, a system that you won't find any other human civilization has ever used. And this is something that we should be proud of. Because today, Western academics and Orientalists, they say that the only way we can verify, anything to any individual in history is through their system, right? Which, doesn't rely on narration. It doesn't rely on identifying who are the people who narrated to us these words. Their method relies on the scientific method, right? And that is what they call hard evidence, manuscripts, written, recorded evidence. And we Muslims should not feel inferior, right? When we hear this, we shouldn't feel that, they have their system and we have our own system. No, we should actually go on the offensive and critique their system. Right? I say this because many of you may have heard in the last couple of days a very famous, da'i, in the West, in the US, who's also an academic, right? Who's saying that when it comes to hadith literature, when we talk about hadith among Muslims, we address it in a certain way. But when we talk about hadith among Western academics, we talk about it in a different way, right? As if to say that these are two different systems that are valid and acceptable, right? Why not say that we have our system, which is not only valid but reputable, and go on the offensive and critique their system, right? That's what we need to do. As Shaykh Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, he says that when it comes to proving things, right? When it comes to proving things, there are three ways of proving realities. There are three ways of proving the realities of things. This is what they refer to as epistemology. Epistemology, or, how do we prove the reality of things? He says there are three ways. Right? What are they? He says, al-hiss, which is observable evidence, which we can today call the scientific method. He says the second is al-aql, logical evidence. Certain things are proven not by material hard evidence, but through logical evidence. And then he says, number three, a combination of the two. And that is al-khabar. Al-khabar, which is narration, or a report that is narrated to us. A report that is narrated to us. And this is very, very important to understand in this particular day and age in which we're living. Because a lot of people, they think the only way to prove things is by observable evidence. Because that's what we've been taught in school, right? That the only way you can prove something is if you have, if you can see it, if you can observe it through the five senses, right? We say this is one way, only one way of arriving at the truth of something. And that is limited to what? The observable world that we live in. Right? We don't reject science. Right? We don't say that we should not study science. No, we do. But we restrict it to what? To its domain. And that is the observable world that we live in. Science can prove things in this world that we live in. Right? But then there are certain things that science cannot prove. And that is the ghaib, the unseen. Right? And the unseen, certain things can be proven logically, so that's where the second method comes in play, al-aql. Certain things can be proven logically, such as Allah and His existence. You can logically prove that Allah exists, right? But then certain things cannot even be proven through logic. And that's where we need, another evidence. And that's where khabar comes into play. Transmission or reports. And this is something we use, right? This is something we use in our day-to-day lives, right? For example, if someone says, someone he comes after traveling from somewhere, and he says, I went to this island. And he starts narrating a story, I saw this and I saw that. Are you going to accept his narration or are you going to reject it? He has no evidence. He hasn't taken any pictures, any videos. He has no evidence, no hard evidence. Are you going to accept his report, his khabar, or are you going to reject it? What are you going to do? It depends on what? Exactly. You're going to use certain criteria to verify whether what he's saying, we can accept it or not. Right? And that is basically what we have in the Hadith sciences. Right? If this person is known to be reliable, and we know him, he's not a stranger to us, we know him. We know him to be reliable, we know him to be trustworthy. He doesn't tell stories, he doesn't lie. We'll accept his narration. Right? And that is basically the system what we call the Isnad system, right? And this is something we should be proud of, this system that the scholars of Hadith have basically established. So let's go through this system of Hadith. But before we do that, we have to distinguish between the various sciences of Hadith. There are many branches of the sciences of Hadith, and it's important to identify each one, right? And this is for a beginner who may be hearing about the sciences of Hadith for the first time. So very quickly, number one, we have what is known as Mustalah al-Hadith. Mustalah al-Hadith. And this is basically the study of the principles and the rules by which ahadith are classified in terms of their authenticity, their transmission, and the chain of narrators. This is known as Mustalah al-Hadith. Number two, we have what is known as Ilm al-Ilal. Ilm al-Ilal. Ilal is basically the plural of illah, which means a defect. So what do we mean by this particular branch of knowledge of hadith? It is a study of subtle hidden flaws in the chain of narration or the text of a hadith that affect its authenticity. And we'll talk more about this in a little bit. Number three, we have what is known as al-Jarh wa Ta'dil. And that is basically the science of hadith that deals with narrators of hadith, right? Where we study the different narrators who have narrated hadith to us in terms of their credibility and whether they're accepted narrators or not. This is called al-Jarh wa Ta'dil. And the early scholars of hadith, they wrote books on this. Entire biographies of narrators, who these people were, right? And this is very important to know for the scholar of hadith when he's examining the chain of a hadith, right? When he comes across a name, who was this person? Is he reliable? What have the scholars who lived in his time, what did they say about him? Right? And after that we have fiqh al-sunnah, which is the study and application of fiqh based on the authentic sunnah. So this is the fiqh of hadith, right? How we understand not the chain, but what is known as the matan, the text of the hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, such and such. What did he mean by this? This is called fiqh of hadith. So it's important to understand that these are all different branches of the sciences of hadith. Now, our hadith literature has been preserved in different ways. And we spoke about this in the last session. But let's further elaborate on this. So we have preserving the ahadith through memorization. So one generation, they memorized the ahadith from the Prophet ﷺ, the Sahabah. They narrated it to the next generation. That next generation also memorized it, and in this way it carried on. It was also preserved through oral transmission where a narrator orally transmits the hadith, but then the one on the receiving end, he's writing it down, for example. And then we have it being written down. And we mentioned this in the last session that some ahadith were even written in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, but not that many. And we also spoke in the last session about ahadith being compiled in books. And hadith was also preserved by teaching, in the sense of the scholars of hadith having, sessions with their students where they would teach them a hadith. Also, a very important method of having a hadith preserved was traveling to collect hadith. Many of the early scholars would travel, far distances. And imagine in a day and age not like today, where you just hop on a plane and you go to the other side of the world. They would travel on horseback, on camel, sometimes to a distant land, just because they heard that a certain scholar was narrating one hadith. They heard the hadith, but they wanted to hear it directly from him. Right? Look at how, look at how much effort they put into preserving the hadith. They didn't just accept that someone is saying that the Prophet ﷺ said such and such. They would travel, sometimes a very long distance, and sometimes just for one hadith. Also, biographical dictionaries, some of the early scholars from among the tabi'un and atba' tabi'un, they compiled lists of names of the narrators. And this is what I mentioned earlier as being the science of al-jarh wa ta'dil. So you have, for example, Ibn Abi Hatim, who has a book called al-jarh wa ta'dil, in which he mentions all the names of the narrators. Also by giving guidelines on what ahadith are accepted and what ahadith are not to be accepted. And so all of these are different methods that the early scholars, used to preserve ahadith. All right. The hadith of the Prophet ﷺ was transmitted, as we said, from one generation to the next through narration. And they would use different words or different terms to narrate the hadith. And these terms are important to understand, or at least get a brief understanding of, because different wordings were more stronger than others. What do I mean by this? For example, when you say that I met so-and-so and I heard him say such and such, right? That is different than saying so-and-so said such and such, right? What's the difference? Someone may say, isn't that the same thing? What's the difference? What's the difference? So the first one?
So-and-so said, means like you've not added anything, it's exact as what he said. And you had means that you put your interpretation.
Okay. Exactly. So the first one, he actually explicitly said, I met so-and-so and I heard directly from him. Right? So you can ascertain that he heard it from him directly. The second one, even if he lived when he was alive, when his teacher was alive, he may have heard it from him, or he may have heard it from someone else. Right? So there is, some vagueness there, right? So that's why we have different terms that were used by the scholars, the early scholars of hadith. So when they would say haddathana, for example, they would mean that, so-and-so said to us directly. That's why haddathana is the strongest. It is the strongest way of transmitting the hadith. After that is akhbarana, he informed us, which is also, among the strong terms used. And then we have anba'ana, he told us. And then we have sami'na, we heard from him. And sometimes even the Sahabah, radiallahu anhum, they would use all of these in how they would narrate from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? And then we have the last, which is an, meaning I am narrating from so and so. And this last one is what we mentioned as being the weakest, what I mentioned earlier. Right here, the narrator is not explicitly telling you that I heard it directly from him. So you don't know. You don't know, did he hear directly from him or not? Was there a middleman or not? Because if there was someone in between the two of them, we have to know who it was, right? We have to know who that person in between was. Is he reliable? Is he not? Now, when it comes to the Sahaba, there's no need for any of that. If a Sahabi says, عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم or عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, if he uses عن, then it doesn't make any difference, right? It doesn't make any difference because even if he heard from someone else, it would have been another Sahabi, right? And all of the Sahaba are credible. But the problem is later on in the chain, right? Later on in the chain, if someone, he says an, we have to look at this individual, right? And anyways, I'm not going to get too much into it, but basically, the scholars of Hadith, they have identified that certain narrators, they sometimes would use an to be deceptive, right? To intentionally be deceptive, to make it sound as if they heard it from their teacher, but they actually didn't. All right. Something very important to talk about when it comes to the sciences of Hadith is the classification of Hadith. And this is basically studied in what is known as Mustalah al-Hadith, which we mentioned earlier. But I'm just going to give a very brief understanding of the various classifications of Hadith in terms of these ahadith being accepted, in terms of them being authentic. So we have what is known as Sahih. Sahih, which means authentic. And the scholars have mentioned that an authentic hadith is basically a hadith that fulfills 5 criteria. A hadith that basically fulfills 5 criteria. They are, number 1, that the chain has to be continuous to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There shouldn't be any breakage in the chain. And again, that is identified by the scholars of hadith who know these narrators. You know? So a scholar of hadith, he has to have knowledge of the names of narrators. You know, he has to know who these people were, right? For example, even if there is a very famous individual in the chain who's reliable, there's nothing wrong with him, but he's narrating from someone who it is not known that he has ever met, right? Then that's problematic. That's very problematic. Take the example of Hasan al-Basri. Hasan al-Basri. You know, he's a name that even, an average Muslim can identify as being, he was one of the Salaf. Right? There are narrations where he is narrating from Ali radiallahu anhu. Hasan al-Basri is a tabi'i. Right? He's a tabi'i. There's no problem with a tabi'i narrating from a sahabi. However, it is mentioned that Hasan al-Basri never met Ali radiallahu anhu. Or if he did, he was a child at the time, very young. And this helps a scholar of hadith to classify such a hadith as being weak. And so many narrations to Ali radiallahu an are used by Sufis and Shia, in which the narration is through Al-Hasan al-Basri. So we say this is a broken chain, right? Even though, as we said, there's nothing wrong with Al-Hasan al-Basri, there's nothing wrong with Ali radiallahu an. But who's going to understand that? Right? Who's going to understand that? Only someone who has really reached a very high level of knowledge in terms of, the narrators and who they were, when they lived, did they meet these people, etc. Also, the second criteria for a hadith to be considered sahih is that the narrators have to be trustworthy. Right? Each narrator in the chain has to be known to be trustworthy and reliable. Number 3, each narrator has to be known to have a good memory, an accurate memory. So even if he's reliable, but if he's known to have had a weak memory, especially in his old age, then the scholars, they say, we accept his ahadith that he narrated when he was younger, but if he narrated something in his old age, then there's a question mark on that hadith. Number 4, there should not be any defects or contradictions in that narration. And these two things, the first thing is what I mentioned earlier as being known as illah. A hidden flaw in the hadith, in the chain. And even some of the great scholars of hadith, sometimes they'll consider a hadith to be authentic, that later scholars will come and they'll have found in it a hidden flaw that original scholar missed, right? That original scholar missed. These are minor, very hidden flaws in the chain, right? An example is what I mentioned about Al-Hasan al-Basri narrating from Ali radiallahu an. Some scholars, they may have missed this, right? And there are numerous other examples, but that's what we call a hidden defect. As for a contradiction, then this is what is known as a shadh narration. Shadh, meaning that one hadith has been narrated to us, it contradicts other narrations with the same wording. It's the same wording, the same hadith, but there's an addition in this particular narration. How do we deal with it? It contradicts all the other narrations. If it's only one narration on its own, then the scholars say this is shadh, right? We can't rely on it because it's contradicting all the other narrations. So a sahih hadith should not have any contradictions. All right, so this is what is known as sahih. We move on after that to what is known as a Hasan hadith. And this is a hadith that is slightly less reliable than a sahih hadith, but it's still considered acceptable. And this is often due to minor issues with memory, right? It's often due to minor issues with memory. So it's the same criteria as sahih hadith, but there's a problem with the memory. What we mentioned earlier, that accurate memory is not there. So we don't rush to conclude that the hadith is da'if, right? The scholars say this is Hasan. And the first scholar of hadith to use this term was Imam al-Tirmidhi, right? In his Sunan al-Tirmidhi, he often grades his ahadith. Sometimes he says sahih, sometimes he says sahih, hasanun sahih. Sometimes he says Hasan sahih. And this is what he means by that, right? This is what he means by that. Now, sometimes a Hasan hadith may not be because of the hadith itself. The hadith itself is considered weak, but due to corroborating narrations, due to the fact that we have multiple narrations of the same hadith, it moves from being da'if up to Hasan. So let's say you have one hadith that has been narrated through different narrations. Let's say all of them are weak. But because there's so many, the scholars say, there's a good chance the Prophet ﷺ actually did say it. How is it possible that you have so many different narrations narrating? There's a good chance it was said by the Prophet ﷺ, but we don't say it with certainty that it's sahih. So let's call it Hasan. Right? So these are two ways of a hadith being Hasan. Either itself or through another way. And that's why the scholars say you have Hasan li dhatihi, because of itself, wa Hasan li ghayrihi. Hasan because of other multiple narrations. We move on to the last, or not the last, the third type of hadith, and that is what is known as a da'if. And this is what we call a weak hadith. And this is due to issues in the chain, or in the narrators, or in the text. So sometimes it can be in the chain, right? For example, we said there's a breakage in the chain. It's not continuous. Or the narrators themselves. There's a problem with the narrator. A narrator is not reliable. Or he's known to lie. Or in the text of the hadith. Sometimes, the chain seems to be fine, but from the text of it, you can tell there's a problem. And this is something that only, scholars who have, dedicated, their lives to the study of hadith, they're able to pick it up. They're able to pick out these flaws in the text. They're so used to the statements of the Prophet ﷺ that if they hear a hadith attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, they're like, no. This doesn't sound like something that the Prophet ﷺ could have said. Just like every single one of us, you know your own mother and father very well, right? You know how they speak, you know the kinds of things that they would say. Let's say someone comes to you and says, your father has said such and such. And your father would never say such a thing. Right away you'd pick it up. That, no, my father did not say this. Right? So anyways, these are ways of classifying a hadith as being da'if. And when it comes to a da'if hadith, there are many different categories that I'm not going to get into, but this is something that is studied in the science of mustalah al-hadith, right? So a hadith could be da'if for many different reasons, and they're classified accordingly, right? They're classified accordingly. So for example, you have what we said, shadh, right? A shadh hadith. You have a hadith that is mu'allal, a hadith that has a illah, a defect in it. You have a hadith that is called mursal. What is a mursal hadith? What is a mursal hadith? Huh? Yes, where the Sahabi is not mentioned. So it's a continuous chain to the Tabi'i. The Tabi'i says, the Prophet ﷺ said. The Sahabi is missing. We call this a da'if hadith. That is called mursal. Why is it da'if? Because the Sahabi is missing. Right? A Tabi'i doesn't narrate from the Prophet ﷺ. Even if there's a possibility he heard it from a Sahabi. Right? But he has to identify. He has to explicitly say the name of the Sahabi. Now he could say, one of the Sahaba said, and that would be acceptable. Right? That would be acceptable. Why? even though he didn't name the Sahabi. What did we mention earlier? That all of the Sahaba are what we call udul. All of the Sahaba are reliable. We don't question the reliability of a Sahabi. As long as the Tabi'i is reliable, right? The Tabi'i is known, he's reliable, he doesn't tell lies, and he has narrated from the Sahaba. So these are basically the three main categories of hadith. We have one last one that we'll mention here, and that is what is known as Mawdu. A Mawdu hadith is a fabricated or forged hadith, and we put this as a separate category because this is a hadith that can never be accepted under any circumstances, right? Because when it comes to a da'if hadith, the scholars have differed over when we can use a da'if hadith. We should not understand that a da'if hadith is always to be rejected. No. There are some instances when a da'if hadith can be relied upon. Right? We gave the example of that. If there are corroborating reports, multiple narrations, it could raise the da'if to Hasan. Also, the scholars have said that when it comes to other than halal and haram, and other than aqeedah related matters, a da'if hadith can be used, right? But they put conditions for that. And so Imam Ahmad, for example, he says that when it comes to halal and haram, we are very strict in what we would accept of hadith. But when it came to as-sirah and al-maghazi, the battles, meaning the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ and the events in his life, he said we would go easy. So the scholars would go easy when it comes to accepting da'if narrations in other than ahkam, right? In other than halal and haram. Because this is now sharia. This is now you worshipping Allah. And in other than aqeedah, right? Because this is related to our beliefs. What we have to rely on is what is 100% authentic. But when it comes to, a seerah, events, history, or as the scholars say, what is known as a'mal, fada'il al-a'mal, the virtues of certain good deeds, right? They would go easy. They would say there's nothing wrong with narrating a hadith. But as I said, there are conditions to that. So for example, it cannot be extremely weak. Also they said that particular amal, that particular good deed has to be established in the sharia. For example, let's say there's a hadith that talks about the fada'il, the virtues of, let's say, salat al-duha, praying salat al-duha, that you get such and such reward, you get such and such in Jannah. Let's say the hadith is da'if. The scholars say it's okay to narrate that hadith, to mention it. Why? Because Salatul Duha is an established sunnah based on other authentic ahadith, right? The point is, a da'if hadith is not always rejected, right? There could be instances when we can rely on it, but that has conditions that the scholars have mentioned. As for a mawdu hadith, a fabricated hadith, here we're talking about hadith where a narrator somewhere along the chain is known to make up a hadith. He is known to fabricate, right? We reject that hadith, and it can never be used. And the scholars have compiled books in which they have, mentioned these mawdu', forged and fabricated ahadith. And the reason why this can never be accepted is because the Prophet ﷺ gave a stern warning. And that is his statement that whoever knowingly, intentionally tells a lie about me, then let him prepare his seat in the hellfire. The only one who would do such a thing is a munafiq, a hypocrite, or an enemy of Islam. And that's why it is basically the deviant sects that arose in that period of time. When they wanted to attract people to their sect, they would forge a hadith to make it seem as if the Prophet ﷺ was supporting them, to attract followers. And so these are the various classifications of hadith, and this is where we will stop for today, insha'Allah ta'ala. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. وصلى اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.